Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Petersfield Museum and Art Gallery. My name is Jeremy Mitchell. I'm chair of the wonderful Edward Thomas Fellowship and shortly to be chair of the equally wonderful Petersfield Museum and Art Gallery, just in case I didn't have enough to do. I'm experiencing today with the 4th Edward Thomas Literary Festival is a wonderful collaboration between Petersfield Museum and the Edward Thomas Fellowship. And without the input from both organisations, we couldn't bring you this today. But we're also very grateful to Arts Council England, National Lottery Players, Robert McAtter, who's a local East Hampshire District Councillor, the Edward Thomas Fellowship themselves, and individual donors, without whom we would not be able to bring you this wonderful festival and glorious speakers such as Seán Street, who's a poet, writer, broadcaster, professor, whose work is deeply entwined with the sonic textures of life, particularly birdsong and the sounds of nature, which is perfect for a festival that's called Edward Thomas Poetry, Prose and Birdsong. A former BBC radio producer and Professor Emeritus at Bournemouth University. I think you have a sound studio named after you at Bournemouth? Yes. Sean's been at the forefront of exploring the connections between sound, memory and poetry. In many ways, his work resonates with the themes of pastoral tradition and a sense of place, echoing all those nuances that are found in the poetry of Edward Thomas. And you don't need to hear any more from me. So, Sean, over to you.
Thank you.
And birdsong.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, very much. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Lovely to be here. I mean, it's particularly wonderful to be here for me because I have such close connections with Petersfield and the village hinterland around. I must just tell you that my great-grandfather was a brickmaker who built his own house on the Hawkley Road at West List. My grandmother was married in List Church. My grandfather later farmed in the Meon Valley, East and West Meon. And during the First World War, my father and his brother and sister were evacuated out of Portsmouth and stayed in those places, and really informed the whole family's love of the countryside and the landscape and all those things that go with it. So for me to be back, in fact, back in 1989, this gets even more personal because I was commissioned to write curate a book called Petersfield: A Historical Past, which is one of those books of photographs, of old photographs. And I mentioned that on social media a few weeks ago, and I said this came out in 1989, it's long lost, nobody remembers it, it's forgotten completely. And the Petersfield bookshop came back and said, actually, we still have 3 copies left. Yeah, proper J.R. Hardy money. Anyway, enough of that. It's a delight to talk about Edward Thomas, sound, and in particular, birdsong. The great radio feature producer, Piers Plowright, once said, music is about more than its sound. And a letter from Edward Thomas to W.H. Hudson, written from Berryfield Cottage, just up the way there, in 1907, tells us in 3 lines, I think, quite a lot about Thomas's response to sound and his own complex relationship to the world. He said, I owe an apology to the peacock and to you, saying I disliked the peacock's cry. It was the people on the terraces I disliked, not the peacock at all. The cry itself is as fine as a fox's yelling at night, I have been thinking lately. So this is a personal and, albeit has to be fairly brief, connection today with Edward Thomas as a sound recorder. Think of him as a sound recorder, a human sound recorder, a receiver of sonic waves. In particular, birdsong, heard and imagined, and a translator of those sounds into words. I've worked with sound, as Jeremy suggested, making radio features for BBC networks and other broadcasters. And I've taken it for granted the ability to record. You know, with all my generation have been able to record. When I started recording for the BBC, it was with a Ewer, which was, for those of you who've never seen one, was portable in the broadest sense of the word. But it was portable, and it represented a great step forward. So you were able to go on location with one of these things. It was responsible for a whole generation of my generation for a range of chronic back problems. And in my case, the back heals not. But anyway, from now, of course, we can record with something like that. You know, much bigger than a packet of cigarettes or something. So that's Exhibit A. That's what I'm going to call it. But so things have changed great. But all that fact that you can now record so easily, we can record on our phones and all that, started me thinking about the very act of recording, of how we take for granted the fact that technology can provide the sounds we want to hear at the touch of a button. It's when we try to express emotionally, it's when we try to record emotionally what we hear, that we turn to words. When Edward Thomas was 11 years old, in 1889, in Germany, a Frankfurt businessman went to a trade fair in Leipzig. When he came home, he brought a gift for his 8-year-old son. It was the latest wonder, an Edison phonograph, complete with blank cylinders. The boy's imagination was captivated, and he began at once recording the sounds around him. From this time, we have the first known recording of a bird, an Indian Sharma bird, which the family kept as a pet in a kind of home menagerie. The boy's name was Ludwig Koch, who was probably the greatest pioneer of sound recording, and particularly natural history recording, almost a David Attenborough of his time. He was broadcasting in his guttural German tones. For my generation, I was brought up listening to children's hour, and there was Ludwig Koch on the radio, scaring the living daylights out of me, playing recordings of what he called ghosts of mermaids, which turned out to be seals in Hebridean caves. But I saw the pictures. To hear sound is revelation. To describe a sound opens the door to truly knowing it. Thomas, by all accounts, had a beautiful voice. It would have been a good voice for radio, but there was no sonic witness to it, as far as I know, just the recollections of those who knew him. Likewise, he never had access, as far as I know, to even the earliest kind of listen device. He did have a camera. We've got results of that, but the Edison devices that were gradually becoming available during the Edwardian and Georgian years, they were around, but he didn't get one. We may be thankful for that. Sound is invisible. It moves through time, as we do. It emerges or strikes, it fades or ceases, leaving silence. It's often ghostly, unearthly, until it's explained or given context. It can belong to what Freud called das und heimlich, the uncanny. Ludwig Koch's recordings, and you can still pick them up, tend to isolate the bird, to give it centre stage. When we hear his recordings of, say, a blackbird or a thrush, somehow he manages to put the bird in a spotlight, almost like a studio room. There's often no ambience around it. In fact, he actually had a team of men to beat out other birds from the surrounding trees so he could concentrate on one particular bird he was after, which is probably not what we do now. However, there is much of das und heimlich, I think, in the writing of Edward Thomas. but because he does acknowledge ambience, the place in which the event occurs. And I think in that he recalls one of his great heroes, Richard Jefferies, and also I think W.H. Hudson. Sound as ambience, a surrounding auditory sense of place as a soundstage for the foreground performers. He says in The Childhood of Edward Thomas that his very earliest writings consciously sought to emulate Richard Jefferies. Jefferies in the later essays particularly often comes back to this ambient sound of nature, and then he goes beyond it. He performs with his senses what today we would ask of a parabolic microphone, creating a field recording of a place in the very act of being. These observations sometimes turn into lengthy meditations, as in his essay, The Pageant of Summer. Jefferies finds himself here in a deep woodland. As his listening intensifies, layers of sound begin to come to the surface. I became aware of a sound in the very air. It is not the midsummer hum, which will soon be heard over the heated hay in the valley and over the cooling hills alike. It's not enough to be called a hum, and does but just tremble at the extreme edge of hearing. If the branches wave and rustle, they overbear it. The buzz of a passing bee is so much louder, it overcomes all of it that is in the whole field. That's Richard Jefferies. We experience the world through a combination of senses. But for Thomas, as for Jefferies, the door to that experience is stillness. We come back time and again in Edward Thomas's writing to silence as a bed on which other sounds rest and out of which they emerge. Jefferies, in his introduction to White's Selborne, wrote, "It is in quietness that the invisible becomes visible. Vacant field grows full of living things. In the hedges, unsuspected birds come to the surface of the green leaf to take breath." In 1909, when his biography of Richard Jefferies was published, Edward Thomas published another book, The South Country, a chronicle of 12 months wandering across England, south of the Thames and Severn, and east of Exmoor. In its pages, it's not hard to sense the influence of Jefferies, as in this passage from the chapter on spring. On every hand, there is a drip and gush and ooze of water, a crackle and rustle and moan of plants and trees unfolding and unbending and greeting air and light. And over and through it all, a cuckoo is crying and crying, first overhead, then afar, and gradually near, and retreating again. He is soon gone, but the ears are long afterwards able to extract the spirit of the song, the exact interval of it, from among all the lasting sounds, until we hear it as clearly as before, out of the blue sky, out of the white cloud, out of the shining grey water. It is a word of power. Cuckoo. Thomas loved the sound of cuckoo. It occurs often in his prose, and for him it seems to have become almost mystical. And there's a feeling of presence in that passage, the surround sound of nature, that is really like Jefferies and is most intensely engaged, I think. Verbal music plays on our ear even when we hear it in the imagination, as when we're reading to ourselves. Put another way, the eye picks up a signal and the mind translates that visual cue into imagined sound that rings on in the memory. Almost all poetry is connected with sound because sound is language and language is sound. T.S. Eliot wrote of what he called the auditory imagination, that is the feeling of syllable and rhythm penetrating far below the conscious levels of thought and feeling. This potent sense sinks to the most primitive and forgotten, returning to the origin and bringing something back, seeking the beginning and the end, fuses the old and obliterated and the trite, the current and the new and the surprising, the most ancient and the most civilized mentality. No wonder Robert Frost recognised the poet under the prose when he read Edward Thomas's In Pursuit of Spring, published in April 1914. We hear silently as we read, and so we have a clear audio picture of human sound, caught in the moment, near the start of the journey, like this, in chapter 2 of In Pursuit of Spring. "Wretched weather," said the man, speaking through the pencil in his mouth as he straddled the bicycle. At one sentence, there's so much sound of effort in that. We can imagine, because we've been there, we can imagine a man getting onto a bike. The sound, the effort of getting onto it. And "Wretched weather," said the man. That's the sound, isn't it? I mean, we don't need that prop to know, because we've heard it. It translates to our memory. We hear with our ears, but we listen with our minds. Forced to focus on a room or a space, our listening moves into a new level of consciousness, just as our eyes grow accustomed to darkness. The composer Pauline Oliveros called it sound fishing. She said, "Listening is the basis of sound fishing. Pull the sound out of the air like a fisherman catching a fish. When the water is clear, you might see the fish. When the air is clear, you might hear the sounds." Edward Thomas is extraordinarily sensitive to the sounds of undersounds and the minutiae of microsounds under apparent silence. Hearing may be the first sense to awaken in us, and perhaps, who knows, the last to desert us at death. In the childhood of Edward Thomas, there is sound that awakens the whole book, the sound of a song, not of a bird, but of his mother. He wrote, "Her singing at fall of night, especially if we were alone together, soothed and fascinated me as though it had been divine. At once the mightiest and the softest sound in the world." So his antennae were tuned right from the start. In his first book, The Woodland Life, which I think he wrote when he was 19, he talks about the hedgerows where robins rustle gently and fly a yard or two, or a blackbird blusters out. Blusters out. John Clare might have written that. In that same book, his chapter on winter in Richmond Park opens like a curtain going up at a theatre. Keen frost and a grey hanging fog have numbed and silenced all life within the park, until the melancholy, long-drawn whistle of a starling breaks the stillness. Then the mist lifts, the curtain goes up, and widespread companies of rooks go dinning overhead. On every side, the clamouring sparrows descend to scour the grass and underwood. Some of them wander to the pools, and where the ice does not prevent, indulge themselves in a bath, spraying the water with their rapid play of wings and quarrelling noisily for the best places. As here, elsewhere, Thomas sets the stage and gives us the scenery before the performers enter. In Roseacre Papers in 1910, there's this essay called Recollections of November, and much of the same dramatis personae. The first blackbird awakened with a cornet call, and sparrows, like schoolboys, on their cold mornings, chattered and flustered, but dared not leave the eaves, and all the wool cold of the windy dawn seemed to be in the starling's thin piping. Elsewhere in the Woodland Life, there's an almost shorthand series of notes that are like dictated birdsong. Chiff-chaff singing, our earliest visitor, late this year, accompanied by the gentler willow wrens. London to Marlborough Forest on foot, swallows and cuckoos' voices along the road westward. Whitethroat has come, singing and chattering with his I did, ceaselessly. Snipe bleating over water meadows near Hungerford. This sound, which most loud when the bird is in full flight, circling upward or hovering, makes the air vibrate and seems to be caused by the play of wings. Peewits making a similar noise with their sharpest turns, diving and ascending. Their joints seem to creak. Loud laughter of the woodpecker, clarion song of the missel thrush, whitting of the nuthash, somewhere up in the beech bowl. But his sonic sense goes beyond anything a microphone could hold, because it conveys what it was like to be there, to him, to be there and to be him in that place. In a chapter from The Heart of England called One Green Field, he writes of how in spring the linnets sprinkle song like audible sunlight. This quality of deep listening, of synesthetic sense, of sound under silence, is present in quite a bit of Thomas's prose writing, even in the early work. In Oxford, published in 1903, you find him at one point listening to the juxtaposition of song and silence. And in the evening, that accumulated gloom raised the whole question between silence and speech, but did not answer it. The song of the blackbird is heard, cushioned among the sleepier cooing of doves. And when they cease, how fine is the silence. When they revive, how fine is the song. The silence seems to appropriate and not destroy the song. The blackbird, too, seems to appropriate and make much use of the silence when he sings. And here in the same college garden, he's listening to the trees. Now and then, they talk a little, and when one talks, the others follow, but as a rule, the wryneck or jackdaw talks instead. And with them, it seems to be near the end of the day. In the angriest gale, and in the scarcely grass-moving air of twilight, the cypresses nod, almost without sound. Again, in what he calls Oxford's most peaceful and homeliest of churchyards, St. Peter's in the east, overlooked by St. Edmund Hall and Queen's College in the old city wall, there is a peace which only the thrush and the blackbird break, and even their singing is at length merely the most easily distinguishable part of the great melody of the place itself. It seems that Thomas finds the sounds of the natural world a bridge between visible and invisible things. As he writes in his chapter on women, nature and poetry and feminine influence on the poets, seeking the desire to, quote, create, to possess, to extend a personality in such a way that it can be said, not all of me shall die, and the breath goes finally out of my body. Probably John Clare heard this impulse when he lay under the huge elm, the shepherd's tree, thinking of past times and deeds until the wind of that eternal ditty sings, humming of future things that turn the mind to leave some fragment of itself behind. And yet, his doubts, his self-criticism were never far from the surface regarding his own abilities, as were his thoughts on science and nature. In a letter to Gordon Bottomley from Berryfield Cottage in May 1907, Thomas writes, "A man in the country must be a naturalist, an historian, an agriculturalist, or a philosopher, and I am none of them." But later in the same letter, in what I think is quite a significant paragraph, he says this: "Perhaps we worry less about conclusions, generalizations nowadays, in our anxiety to get the facts and feelings down, just as science picks up a million pebbles and can't arrange them or even play with them. I am, by the way, going to plead for a little more playfulness and imagination, if it be got, in archaeology, topography, and so on. The way in which scientific people and their followers are satisfied with data in appalling English disgusts me, and is moreover wrong." Well, from the time when Edward Thomas's poems started to emerge, he was able to take his listening into new realms, where memory and the senses combined to open, well, some dark corridors. But he also got this, I think, in his early reading and writing, and in the prose which, when he declared the form, as Frost suggested, made way for the great poems. Here again, in the South Country, there are three sounds in the wood this morning: the sound of waves, that has not died away since the sea carried off church and cottage and cliff and the other half of what was an inland wood. The sound of trees, a multitudinous frenzied sound of rustling dead oak leaves still on the bough, of others tripping along a path like mice, or winding up in sudden spirals and falling again, or dead boughs gratefully grinding, of pliant young branches lashing, of finest twigs and fir needles sighing, of leaf and branch and trunk booming like one, and through all these sounds, the song of a thrush. You knew there'd be a bird there somewhere. With these lines from Roseacre Papers. Go one humming May afternoon to the fields, along a sweet and wildsome pathway, startled by your footfalls, for which you may fancy you hear the wounded note of a spirit of the spot escaping. Out of sight, the bees are noisy in the willow top. Silence, stillness, as with all sound, is deeply linked to the imaginative world. Black words on white paper provide sound meanings and clues that, as they touch the visual, reach out to the listener in various and changing ways. So often it comes back to silence as the bed upon which the sound grows, from which it emerges. In that prolific prose year of 1909, he wrote The South Country, and in it, with a melding of the senses, this of Surrey, inventing a new collective term for landscape. Then I saw a huge silence of meadows, and beyond these, of hills that raised two breasts of empurpled turf into the sky, and above the hills, one mountain of cloud that beamed as it reposed in the blue, as in a sea. A huge silence of meadows. I'd almost have written a meditation of meadows. And here's Thomas slipping seemingly into a trance in an April evening in Wales. In the oaks and hazels the wood pigeons cooed again, but when the sunset was perfect, they ceased as if they already feared and loved the white and green lines that lay over the hills. Then the silence grew and grew, exciting and paining and pleasing and never satisfying the ear, so that I knew not whether the silence or the speech that preceded it was more mysterious. For him that has ears, there is nothing more expressive than speech, but it is never unequivocal as silence is. Reading is listening. Just as listening is a kind of reading. Sitting on a train, travelling through the industrial suburbs of a city on a wet Monday morning on the way to work, listening to a radio play or a written story or a poem, it can all transport us in its own way. Time shifters transcend the context in which we experience them. In his short story, The Ship of Swallows, Thomas begins with sound that moves us with the precision and concision of a poem from one reality to another. I did not see them fly up, but presently two swallows were twittering on the chimney of the cottage. It was not the musical, happy twitter of sunlight, but lower and perhaps timid. They did not yet dare to launch themselves into the air for the day's flight. It was sound, nevertheless, that prevented me from thinking of anything else. I did not notice the thrushes any longer whilst listening to this low twitter. It was soft and pallid as light, and increased with it in quality very slowly. I was now leaning back and looking at nothing but the whitening grey sky. I do not think I closed my eyes, but I found myself looking up at the bows of a huge, dark ship, very high and overhanging me, as if with dew. We listen to ourselves, even as it absorbs the world around us from the womb onwards, heard through the filter of our own heads. When we read Thomas, we enter his sonic world, hear his contrasting, murmuring soundscapes through his ears, and over it all, unmistakable and inimitable, the presence of his voice. Our George Thomas wrote, whenever he wrote to please himself, he let the words choose him, and he was content. One such book could be said to be the 1911 collection of stories called Light and Twilight. Among them is an extraordinary extended prose poem of a piece called Winter Music, in which he sets off on a late February day, walking through a landscape that is on the point of reawakening. The chaffinches began to sing. Their fresh yet sleepy and invariable tune is appropriate to warm, still air, and in this wind over the Rhine, so early in the year, they could not deliver their full song, but at first only the 3 or 4 opening notes, and then broke off as though they'd forgotten it or resented it. But later the mood changes. In his room at evening, a strange music emerges. First, a thin wisp of sound in his mind that grows and builds into a vast, almost monstrous hymn of creation. And it emerges out of silence. That great silence, he writes, the first of things and the last, on which life has intruded for a little while, that great silence that is all about us. And in amongst it, there is birdsong. Sweet and wild and swift, the birds sang melodies that were threshed by the wind, washed by the dew. They sang as if they had never sung before, as if they were happy to sing forever. I knew that multitudinous song, emparadised, remote, serene, only it had never sounded so fair. It's as though a doorway has opened. It's the art of listening beyond hearing, whole mind attention to the sonic symptoms of the world. In some of Richard Jefferies' last essays, notably in works like In Hours of Spring, he mourns the fact that his health separates him from the natural world, while at the same time all of this will continue after he's gone. He writes, but today I have to listen to the lark's song, not out of doors with him, but through the window pane. And the bullfinch carries the rootlet fibre to his nest without me. It is the fate of the outsider who comes to feel himself a member of a tribe that in the end has a culture and a being that actually exists independently of him or her. Yet it is through this very quality of the outsider that all such writers of nature find themselves capable of expressing their powers of seeing, listening, and exploring in terms of humankind and into other spheres of consciousness. It's part of the job to be an outsider, just as it is for the poet, in order to find new ways of seeing, hearing, and saying. In 1901, Thomas wrote a letter to Ian McAllister in which he speaks of a move from 7 Blandfield Street, Nightingale Lane, Clapham Common. He writes, don't laugh at Nightingale Lane. It's still not an unpleasant road of large houses with leafy gardens and lawns. Once it had a fine music for my boyish ear, and I suppose it was only because I was an outsider that I had never heard the nightingale there. Birdsong in Edward Thomas almost always has a surrounding context. His inner microphone records the sound as a key part of the sense of the place. We're seldom far away from the sound of rain in Edward Thomas. The rain is often the sound that obliterates others, but somehow seems to amplify birdsong. Just that the birds sing louder. In Roseacre Papers, there's an essay on the subject. In this London garden, there was one day that I may not omit, for the rain that buried it said many things which I have copied. The shadow of the lime trees lay soft upon the grass, wonderfully soft because of the shy early sunlight. A bird sang such blithe notes as awakened the soul, disrobed it of the dishonours and disgusts of ages, restoring it to paradise. And a few pages further on spring days like this, when a grass scent came into the streets as if the fields and woods were insurgent, near at hand, it was to the garden we went, counted daffodils and lime leaves, listening for the new-come martins that sang before they were seen in the dark. Edward Thomas's poetry and prose are brushed by the sense of the transient, the fleeting sound, smell, or feeling. Thomas teaches us to listen to sound under silence. And not just the sound. A machine can record that. But the machine has no brain, so it can't tell you how it felt to hear the sound. It can't consider the human and spiritual implications of hearing that moment within the context of a human state of mind in that particular place. It is, after all, the mind that listens, not the machine, not even the ear, which only hears. The best and most perceptive of today's sound recordists, Jeff Sample, Chris Watson, Bernie Krause, and others, know that. The American natural history recordist Mike Bullock wrote this only very, very recently. As wildlife sound recordists, we often say that we capture sound, a term that evokes histories of colonization and resource abuse. However, it's not capturing. Sound is not vacuumed out of the air by the microphone. Rather, we would call recording an act of writing. A sound recording device is writing a story of what the microphone hears, a story that can be played back through a loudspeaker or headphones. What recording can't do, though, is tell you what it was like to be there, because we experience the world through all our senses. Nor does it tell you what it was like to be you at that time. In the Happy-Go-Lucky Morgans, Mr. Torrance tells a story which may be the origin of Thomas's unknown bird later in the poetry. In along he's drawn attention to this in a note in the collected poems. Torrance remembers a certain cypress tree. Birds were continually going in and out of it, but never built in it. Only one bird sang in it, and that was a small sad bird, which I do not know the name of. It sang there every month of the year. It might be early or it might be late, on the topmost branch of the plume. For long, but frequently and always suddenly, it was black against the sky, and I saw it nowhere else. The song was monotonous and dispirited, so that I fancied it wanted us to go, because it didn't like the cheerful garden and my father's loud laugh and my mother's tripping step. I fancied it was up there watching the clouds and the very distant things in hope of change, but nothing came. It sang again and waited in vain. My father did not like the bird. He was often looking at it and noting its absence, as I did. The day after my sister died, he threw a stone at it. One time I saw him angry and killed it. But a week later came another, and when he heard it, he burst into tears. And after that he never spoke of it again, but just looked up to see if it was there when he moved in or out of the porch. Ludwig Koch's perfectly realised recordings have given us birdsong as isolated specimens. For Thomas, the voices of birds are spirit voices, the very substance of the natural world, known and unknown, articulating itself. Sometimes it brings in wonder, sometimes despondency, deep inner sadness. One of his many meditations on rain comes in chapter 11 actually, of the Yield Way. It begins as he's trying to sleep, and gradually the sound soaks into him. I put my face to the window. There is nothing out there but the blackness and the sound of rain. I am alone. Once I heard through the rain a bird's questioning water cry, once only, and suddenly it seemed contained, and the solitary sound brought up against me the order of nature, all its beauty, exuberance, and everlastingness, like an accusation. I am not part of nature. I am alone. There's another echo, I think. Richard Jefferies, the outcast Jefferies of Isles of Spring. The sounds of birds seep through his sleep as he seeks it or emerges from it. The opening of chapter 5 in the Yield Way. The rooks had been talking in my sleep much too long before I started next day. Their voices and the blazing window blind described the morning to me before I stirred. I could see and feel it all, and if I could write it down as I saw and felt it, this would be a good book and no mistake. Then the thrushes sang, and he's out on the road, eating a wild strawberry, regaining himself. And Edward Thomas' morning often seems to begin with thrushes. The last chapter in Pursuit of Spring is like that. When I woke at 6, the light was good, but the light was of rain. One thrush alone was singing. A few starlings whistled. Today, of course, Thomas would listen and notice sad change. Appalling numbers of our song thrushes have gone. And then now, he did a catalogue of them, and now birds named by him in his prose books, it would be a depressing litany of loss. All of which makes his writings on birdsong and the topographical context, the time and the place in which he heard them, all the more precious. Strange birds, unknown birds, even to a man who knew his birds well, and birds that hid their own mystery within their songs. Here's Thomas the Insomniac in an essay of that name, The Last Sheaf, in The Last Sheaf. The other night I awoke just as the robin was beginning to sing outside in the dark garden. Beyond him, the wind made a moan in the little fir copse, as of a forest in a space magically enclosed and silent. And in the intervals of his song, silence fell about him like a cloak which the wind could not penetrate. As well as I knew the triple cry farther off of the cock and first crow, I knew this for the robin's song, pausing but unbroken. Though it was unlike any song of a robin I'd ever heard in daylight, standing or walking among trees. Outside in the dark bush, to me lying prostrate, patient, unmoving, the song was absolutely monotonous, a chain of little thin notes linked mechanically in a rhythm identical at each repetition. This was not the voluntary personal utterance of a winged sprite that I used to know, but a note touched on the instrument of night by a player unknown to me, save that it was he who delighted in the moaning fir trees and in my silence. Those last essays are full of birds and birdsong. In one of the episodes in London Miniatures, he's in Kew Gardens on a January day, sensing the kinship between birds and trees. The whistle of the nuthatch, solitary in the top branches, makes the elm trees happy. The ash is flattered by the great tit that hangs so long on its twigs, saying chitterbob. And then, and over again, I'll wait. The beech knows well that it is right for a green woodpecker to rush laughing loudly into its arms. When the fir has a band of starlings piping together on its crest, it's an exile no longer. The hawthorn has its bullfinch and is comforted. In The Friend of the Blackbird, he meets an infirm man on one of his walks, an invalid he calls him, and they talk and they listen together. On one occasion, to a blackcap in full song. The little dead leaf-coloured bird quivered all over. His throat swelled in bubble after bubble. His lifted black head was turned from side to side as he sang, and he moved slowly among the blossom. The high, quick, dewy notes filled the paralytic with a thin, exquisite pleasure, as if his soul had climbed upon the line of his vision and crept into the singing bird. All these things are mine, he said. They are me. And that is not all. I am them. There's a whole essay on the first cuckoo, for Thomas, that iconic bird. The first cry of the cuckoo in spring is more to us than the new moon. The first flicker and twitter of a swallow is its only possible rival. The first blackbird song or peewit's love cry, the first hawthorn leaves, are as nothing, even to those who regard them, compared with the cuckoo's note. while there are many for whom it is the one significant natural thing throughout the year. The old become fearful lest they should not hear it. Having heard it, they fear lest it should be for the last time. And this from his piece called Midsummer. He's in the Lake District. Often I hear no music but the stones ringing as I walk. Unless the peewit sings, or a wheatear flitting about me, saying alternately chook and sweet. Once or twice in the day, far away, over the pallid rock and misty dark bushes, a cuckoo calls, not the cuckoo of the South Country, but a faultless cuckoo. I've not seen him. He is as vague as Helvellyn northward and Ingleborough eastward. His note seems an echo, long treasured, and now delivered by the rocks of Whitbarrow, that make arched leaps, and then fall perpendicularly to the flat river land. His voice skirts us, being a perishing thing. It does not really enter the circle. By the time the Dimmock poets gathered, the world was becoming noisier, and it's not the Scott sense, of course. Below all today's cacophony, however, there remain subtler sounds, as the COVID months and years taught us. When Robert Frost demonstrated the sound of sense to Thomas on that walk on the Limerick landscape, chronicled by Eleanor Fargen, his thoughts found in his student really understanding, ready to go, I think, to write. Edward Thomas teaches us to listen. Sound recording, switching on a machine, donning a pair of headphones can help us because it is the process of rendering listening self-conscious. When we take a photograph, we're witnessing ourselves seeing. When we record a sound, we're listening to ourselves listening. Meanwhile, words carry sounds to our minds, also enabling to interpret what we hear, to celebrate the experience with ourselves. What am I hearing? And who is it that listens? Edward Thomas wrote a wonderful passage about words, because words were effectively his recording devices. It's in the feminine influence on the poets. Words are alive, but still half wild and imperfectly domesticated. They're quiet and gentle in their ways, but they're like cats, to whom night overthrows our civilization and servitude. Words never consent to correspond exactly to any object, unless, in scientific terms, they're first killed. Hence, the curious life of words in the hands of those who love all life so well that they do not kill even the slenderest words, but let them play on, and such are poets. The magic of words is due to their living freely among things, and no man knows how they came together in such a way when a beautiful thing is made. And so it is that children often make phrases that are poetry, and grown men with dictionaries are murderous with words as entomologists are with butterflies. While we might sometimes discuss with Edward Thomas that he had issues with science and scientists, just as we might feel sometimes the early prose can be a little overwritten in places, declaring the form would fix that, frame those words into the shapes they would become. And be that as it may, words are the tools of Edward Thomas's recording studio. It starts and ends with listening. But listening to what? Music is about more than its sound, said Piers Plowright. In the prose there are veins of gold that Edward Thomas would come to mine in the poetry. His writings capture the reality and the spirit of the song in what he heard. But there are times when he also seems to hear a music he doesn't, for all his knowledge, understand. Coming from birds just out of sight, just out of reach, a familiar song that changes strangely into something else within him. We can be thankful, I think, that Edward Thomas never had an Edison device. Because his own recorder, his mind, captured more than any recorder ever could. There was the birdsong he heard in his time and place, yes, of course, but there was also the inner sonic response that echoed in his own personal darkness. A key part of the writings he left us. Listen to this finally. On a Lake District hillside. The air is still, The nightjar fills the broad night with a noise as of a shadowy brook running over the dry, pale rocks of the hills. Again he shifts, this time out of hearing. For a time there is no sound on earth, only an owl that cries like a huntsman among the mountains of the moon, winding his horn. Thomas is a faithful recorder of the sound of birds in his time and place. But there are many moments within his prose, his essays, stories, in the prose poems he inserts within his longer writings, when he hears beyond sound, when his listening and the expression of the spirit music that comes to him becomes, I think, transcendent. Find me one of these gadgets that will do that. Thank you.